I must say that from yesterday and the day before, the conversations have been quite exciting. When we decided to have the conversation around the Continental Free Trade Area, we were not exactly convinced that was going to be what would be the most exciting. But I think we see finance ministers very engaged.
Right.
And this is the right way to go. I think that finance ministers, of course, are the ones who are the masters of the borders, they're the masters of the customs, they're the masters of the taxes. And so having finance ministers, I think, particularly engaged, behind the CFTA and dedicated to making it happen is an important element, and we're very, very welcomed by all the delegates who are very curious and very keen and actually want to continue the trend of the conversation through next year. And I think that that's good because it keeps us, we have a target of getting 22 countries ratify the CFTA by January 2019. So if finance and Kenya and Ghana have not made progress, they have ratified.
Right.
So I think we should congratulate them, and they have set up a momentum, which is, I think, going to be, we know that there were many more countries who were trying to be the first. And so now we're saying we need the first 10. So there's another spot for 8 more people to come in. And my sense is that we will be getting that very quickly. So it's an important, and I think finance ministers are beginning to realize in particular that with trade, you actually get more revenues. And I think another big issue on the continent is about raising domestic resources to finance our growth, to power our economies. So this is another engine for them. It's another tool in their toolbox that can allow them to speed up that process.
Let's single one thing out, corruption. You touched a lot about it, mentioning that institutions now should help handle this. So in the past we had corruption, possibly the obvious way, where we saw the procurement procedures or such, but now it's a bit more systemic. We have it either in form of airport levies or maintenance fees, so it's systemic now, well within the process. So when we work out institutions to handle this, how do we trace back to where it all started?
Difficult to understand where it all started, but I think that what we now know is that if you have strong institutions, if you have good processes, then it's easier to fight, to tackle corruption. And just to throw out a few numbers, altogether, the total cost of corruption on the continent now is almost about $1 trillion. This is everything put together. We need about $600 million a year to finance the Sustainable Development Goals. So the question is, it's so obvious that we are losing out on growth, we are losing out on a better future, we are losing out on Agenda 2063, the Africa we want, because of corruption. The petty corruption, but also the grand corruption. And we are hoping that as part of some of the processes that we put in place, the digitalization, we know for sure that you have more corruption when you have human contact. So if you can reduce the amount of human contact, you can clearly reduce the amount of corruption. And part of what we're doing with the free trade area is saying, how can we make sure that countries trade with each other without necessarily having this continuous human contact? How can we remove border controls? And this is why we need finance ministers to work with us to ensure that we can make some of those processes seamless. I think one of the numbers that always comes to mind is the fact that if you're a woman in West Africa trading across boundaries, you have to pay almost from $2 to $23 per kilometer of different kinds of payments to move your goods. This is not sustainable if we want a continent that is going to grow, if we are looking for an Africa we want. So corruption is an important point. There is a very, very important part of the whole corruption agenda is transparency. We need more African countries to open their budgets. We need more African countries to open their processes to ensure that civil society, journalists can understand what's going on, and you need to play your part as journalists, but you need to play it well. You need to be informed, and we hope that as ECA we're giving you a lot more of the information that you need to be able to engage in this debate. It is everybody's issue. Corruption, I think if one person is corrupt, it's a little bit like a bad egg in a bowl of good eggs. Right. Everything gets bad.
What about the resources allocated to the same? It was about 13% of the GDP or something that pushes a country about 1%. So there's a bit of an imbalance. You put in so much resource to try and tackle the issues on corruption, but the revenue or the take-home doesn't match it.
Well, I think that it's an effort that is long-term, and it's an effort that we can ensure that as we make it work, it becomes better. And again, the question is about the sort of the critical mass that you need to then shift the dial on corruption. Today, what we're saying is that for most institutions that are corrupt, we're losing a lot more revenue than we are creating. than we are collecting. Hence the discussion around the informal economy. The informal economy is a little bit of a password for corruption, because we say we don't know them, so they can't pay their taxes. And we are hoping that with trade and with the institutions and the implementation of the Boosting Inter-Africa Trade Strategy, we will be able to put in place policies and systems that will reduce the size of the informal sector, increase the size of our revenues, allow for governments to have a lot more resources for investments that will continue to facilitate this trade. The more revenues governments can raise, the better roads, more energy, logistics, trade gets better.
Our Pan-Africanism now is Pan-Africanism of economies. You mentioned that. Expound on this.
Well, at independence, we were looking for, I would say, social independence. We needed to have a narrative that was African. We needed to make our own decisions. We needed to start creating our own institutions. But I don't think that we understood yet the value and the power of trade, the power of our economies. I think today it is clear that Africa understands, with 1.2 billion people, with a private and corporate sector that will get to about 3.6 trillion, a consumption sector at about 2.5 trillion, that we do have a place in the global economy. And so there has been a shift from the Pan-Africanism, which was saying Africa is good, Africa is important, to an Africa that is saying Africa is an important element of the global economic community. We can now speak economics. And we realize that to be able to sit on the table of the great, we have to have this economic might and economic force. So really it's a Pan-Africanism, because the Pan-Africanism was Africa coming together in 1960. We were coming together for independence, we were fighting liberation. Now we're coming together for economic might, to put our might on the table and say together as Africa we count and we can say something.
And a lot of economic freedoms.
And economic freedoms. And by defining the Continental Free Trade Agreement, we set the terms of engagement for everybody. We don't take the terms of engagement. And this is the economic Pan-Africanism that we're talking about. It's saying on the trade front, we want to say this is how we're going to engage with you. And because we are a continent that you must reckon with, you're going to have to sit down and debate with us.
All right, final question is on the priorities that we're facing now. So the first one was on free movement of people that we saw have a lot more traction. Of course, West Africa had its own rough back with the same. But now we've come back to another question on if we want to create as many jobs as we're implying, we have to work on the manufacturing and industries. But we have contracts that go way back and still are yet to go 20 to 30 more years with people or partners outside the continent. So what kind of conversations are happening about maintaining the revenue here, at least local or consumption the same?
We've been having a lot of discussions around sort of how one can bring in transparency into the process, and we're actually looking at a few norms which we're now playfully calling 5x5 norms, which we'll come back to at some point. But it's about transparency, it's about contracting, it's about ensuring now, because we've been talking about illicit financial flows, because we've been talking about base erosion and price shifting, which is basically the way a lot of the large corporates, and the Thabo Mbeki report shows that about 65% of the sort of illicit flows come from corporations. So how can we do that? And the EU is now looking at those issues. So I think that what we've been able to do, and this is part of the mandate of the ECA, is the whole sort of global governance and global advocacy around some of these big issues. So what we are looking at is to say, how can we make sure that if you have a bad contract, even if it's going for 30 years, that we open it today and we revise it. So again, the economic Pan-Africanism, if all of Africa says we want to look at all those contracts and reopen them, because the companies are going to be interested in staying in Africa, they will open them. But if one country says, I'm going to open it, then very quickly that country can get chastised for saying, oh, you know, there's no stability of contracts. So it has to be a collective effort, and that's where ECA and the African Union and the African Development Bank as Pan-African institutions are saying, we can come behind the countries, we can come behind the continent. So we're now having a global mining contract, which is going to be stabilized for the continent. So there is no race to the bottom inside the continent, and corporations that come from outside can look at it and say, okay, I can negotiate something for country A and a different thing for country B. So that kind of transparency that we are asking for, not only from our countries, but also from the investor countries. We're asking the Europeans, we're asking the Canadians, we're asking the Australians to ensure that the kinds of contracts that their companies negotiate on the continent are robust, is where we are, is the kind of discussion that ECA is particularly leading in this era.